Hello friends. So today we're going to check out how we can make this animated hamburger menu like this using React, TailwindCSS, and Framer Motion. If you happen to not be using TailwindCSS, that is totally fine. I'll make sure that I call out what all of these styles actually do. All of them are pretty straightforward. I mean, what you're looking at on the screen right now is pretty much all of the styles. And for anyone who's learning Framer Motion, I think this is a pretty cool little project because it's super quick and you're going to learn a couple of things that I don't know that I've talked a whole lot about on this channel. The main one being keyframes. So the way that you can define separate, like multiple stops for one animation. I will call out super quick that this component comes from a larger component, which you can find on my website. This navigation that kind of expands out from the corner like this. And if that looks like something that you're interested in, there's a whole bunch of other cool components like these that you can find in the link in my description. Whole bunch of free stuff, some of the paid stuff. I never take any sponsorships or anything on this channel. I just try and build cool stuff. And that's how I support making these videos. Super straightforward. You can just find stuff that you think is cool and then click on code and copy all of that and use it in your projects. But anyways, let's write some code. So taking a look at our project, the first thing that we're going to notice is this little bit of setup that I already have up here at the top. All that I'm doing is taking everything, giving it a background color, and putting everything in the middle of the screen using grid. Nothing fancy if you're not using TailwindCSS. It's literally just display grid, height screen, place everything in the middle, and then a background gradient. So nothing fancy we need to look at there. I'm going to close up this top component and we can just keep our attention down here on this bottom one. That is where everything's going to actually happen. So at a high level, how this is going to work is our button is just going to be a relatively positioned element. And then inside of it, we're going to have a couple of spans, which are going to make up our little bars. Those are going to be absolutely positioned inside of our button. And then we're going to animate them around using Framer Motion. To do that, I'm going to use variants, which I'm going to define on this button. So the first thing that we need to do is import motion from Framer Motion, and then just take our button and turn it into a motion.button. Now, before we actually get into any of the actual kind of animation stuff, I just want to lay everything out with all the styling, and we can do that by just starting with our button. So like I said, I'm going to open up my class names. I'm going to give this a position of relative, again, so that we can absolutely position everything inside of it. I also want to have a set width and height. I'm using a height and width of 20 in Tailwind. That's 80 pixels for anyone that's just using CSS. I'm going to give it a border radius of full or rounded full. It's just 999 pixels just to make it into a circle. This is all just, personal preference, obviously. And then I'm going to give it a background of white with 0 opacity. And then whenever I hover over this element, I just want to bring it up to 20% opacity. I'm also remembering to add transition colors so that it smoothly transitions whenever we hover it. And if we save that, we should now just see whenever we hover in the middle of the screen, we have our little kind of opaque circle. So cool, good start. After this, like I mentioned, I do want to add a couple of spans in here, which are going to make up our little bars. Specifically, we need 3 of them, one for the top, one for the middle, and one for the bottom. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to add 3 motion.spans, one for the top, one for the middle, one for the bottom. Pretty self-explanatory. Now the styling for all of these is also very, very simple. We literally just need rectangles. So I'm going to start with my top span right here. I'm going to give it a position of absolute within the class names. Remember that this is going to be positioned to our wrapping button right here. I'm going to give it a height of 1 and a width of 10, which to CSS people means a width of 40 pixels and a height of 4 pixels. I'm making this pretty big, but obviously you can make it smaller if you want. Same with the height and width up here on the wrapping button. And then finally, I'm just going to give this a background of white. If we save that, we should now have one little kind of rectangle. Perfect. Now our styling for our middle span is going to be exactly the same. So I'm just going to copy paste this down one. And for our bottom span, it's going to be almost the same, but I want the bottom one to be a little bit shorter, or not as wide. So I'm just going to change the width to 5 instead of 10. And this is not going to look any different because all 3 of them are stacked on top of each other right now, but I promise there are 3 little bars there now. After we've done this, we need to actually position these, obviously, accurately within our little kind of wrapping button. And we could do that within our class names, just using like top and left and transform and everything. But later we're going to be animating these values. And for Framer Motion to understand how to animate these values, we're going to need to add inline styles as opposed to adding our positioning styles within our class names. Reason being, Framer Motion needs to be able to take any kind of transforms that you've added on the element and know how to compare those with whatever's animating to give you kind of an accurate animation. So point just being, instead of adding them as class names, I need to add them all as inline styles. So something like this, and then inside of here, we can add our other positioning. I'm actually not going to start with this top one. We'll start by doing the middle one, and then we'll style the top and the bottom one afterwards. So for anybody who hasn't done absolute positioning before, or centering something using absolute positioning before, all that we need to do is set a top and a left of 50%, and then set an X and a Y of minus 50%. This top and left of 50% is going to nudge the top left corner. So here I can actually just show you if I remove the X and Y, It'll actually probably be overlapping right now, but it's going to push the top left corner to the middle. And then whenever I add my minus 50%, it's going to translate back to the left and up based on the width and the height of the actual element, essentially just giving us a centered element. Now I want to do almost the exact same thing on my top span. So I'll paste this up here. The only difference is instead of 50%, I'm just going to do 35%, and that'll nudge it a little bit up. So see, it looks like we have our two kind of parallel bars now. And that just leaves us with our bottom bar, which is going to be just a tiny bit different. So it'll come down. We can actually paste it into to start on our bottom span. But instead of using top, I'm going to use bottom. And because I'm using bottom, I want to do 35%. This lets us just keep the percentage the same on our bottom as we are on our top, like this. But also because we're transforming, or we're positioning from the bottom, instead of minus 50% on the Y, we want to just do 50% like this. And this is almost there, but we're going to see that it's centering still, which may be what you want. That looks cool too. But I actually want to nudge it over to the right so that it's aligned on the right side of these other two bars that are above it. So in order to do that, I'm going to come to my left transform here. Now you could just nudge this around. You could say like 60%, see what that looks like, and just kind of do it like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the calc CSS function like this. And I'm just going to add the number of pixels I actually want to move over. So I want to say plus 10 pixels. Now the reason that I picked 10 pixels is the width of our other bars are 40 pixels, but the width of this bar is 20 pixels, and half of that's on the left, half of it's on the right. So in order to nudge it over enough to the right, I'm just doing plus 10 pixels. And that is the basics of it, just for the actual layout. So we should have something that looks like a hamburger menu now. Obviously now we want to get to the fun part. So I'm going to collapse our style tags right here, so we have a little bit more screen real estate, and we can start thinking about what actually needs to happen now. Essentially how this is going to work is I'm going to take all of these. So I'm going to take our top span and our bottom span, and I'm going to start by just centering them directly in the middle of our container in the exact same way that this is centered. So essentially I want to take, the first move is going to be for this top one. We want to translate it from a top of 35% to a top of 50%. That's going to overlap everything on top of each other. So, if I took my 35% here, made it 50%, it's going to nudge it down. Now you're not going to be able to see it. Super simple. And then what we're going to do after we're done with that is we're going to rotate each of them by 45 degrees. One of them will rotate in one direction and the other two will rotate in the other two directions. Because this one's smaller than the other two, it's just going to layer on top of the other one, and you're not even going to be able to tell that there's 3 rectangles there. So if you don't understand what I mean, I'm literally just saying we're going to rotate by 45 degrees, and then that is going to give us something that looks like an X. Obviously right now it doesn't, but I think you kind of see what I'm getting at with this. We can remove that rotate and get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm actually going to start with our top span, because there's actually kind of 2 steps to this animation, and I think this is probably the easiest way to kind of see what has to happen here. Actually, I lied. So before we even get to that, there's one other thing we need to do really quick, which is these spans need to actually know when to animate. And I don't want to have to kind of manually pass in a Boolean to every single one of these to change their styles. So what I'm going to do instead is come up here to the top, and I'm just going to create a little Boolean toggle. I'm going to do that using useState. So I'm just going to create a new piece of state, which I'm going to call active. Need to remember to also import useState from React up here at the top. To toggle this, we just want it to toggle anytime that we click on button. So we just say on click, we want to take our state, say whatever our previous state was, and just kind of change it so it just goes from true to false. And then what we can do with this is we can tell the outer wrapping button what the variance should be for all of the child elements that are inside of it. Now, the way that we do that is we just use the animate prop, looks something like this, and we can literally just say, hey, if this is active, that means I want a prop of, we'll call it open. You could call this whatever you want. You'll just need to remember it later because you're gonna have to be able to reference it. For mine, I'm just gonna use open, and then I'll also use, say, closed, and those will be my 2 variants. Now that we have that, though, we can actually get back to what I was talking about a minute ago with adding our animations down here. We can start by just adding a basic example that's going to dig a little bit more into how this animate thing works with these little variants. So let's just start by coming on our top span, and we'll define a prop called variance, and inside of this, you're going to have your different configurations for your different variants. Each of these is kind of just the exact same syntax as your normal inline styles like these. So for, say, open, let's just not even do our full animation yet. Let's just rotate it. So we'll say, hey, if it's open, I want to rotate by 45 degrees. And if it's closed, say if it's closed, I want to just rotate by 0 degrees. Cool. So walking through this again before I actually click it really quick, in our animate prop, we are just toggling on and off this little active boolean right here, and that is passing in what our variant should be. Down here, because this is a child of this wrapping motion button, it has in its context what the current variant is, and that just maps to either of these sets of styles. So anytime that it's open, we're going to set the rotate value to 45 degrees. Anytime it's closed, we're going to set it to 0 degrees. Just to see that actually working, we can come over and just click this, and there we go. Anytime we click on this, we rotate by 45 degrees. Super nice. Now this is a little bit springy, which could be cool. Maybe that's something that you want, but I just, for the sake of, really for this example, I just want to kind of explain how you can actually change the behavior of your animation. And more specifically, I want to explain how you can change it over multiple different animations or multiple different elements. So if you just wanted to change kind of the duration and the timing and everything and the easing of this one span, you can just come in here and say transition. And inside of transition, you can define things like duration. So let's say let's do 0.5 seconds. And then you can add like your easing. So I could say ease, and maybe I want to do ease in out instead of this kind of spring easing that we're using. Now we should see that it goes a little bit slower and looks a little bit different. This is actually the configuration that I want to use for our kind of finished animation, but I also want to use it on these other two spans, right? So I could just come down to these ones and define it like this, come down and define it like this, and that totally works just fine, but I don't really like having to duplicate things over and over again. I don't really like having to remember what I kind of set. So what we can use is something called motion config. So I'm going to come up to my framer motion import up here, and I'm going to import motion config. And all that motion config is a simple context provider, which will pass down to all of its children these kind of values, like these transition values. So I'm going to come above my button, so my motion button right here, and I'll add motion config around it. Make sure we're going all the way around the entire button like this. And then what we can do is we can take our transition, which is on our wrapping button right here, remove it from there, and just add it to our motion config up here. And this will pass in our transition values down to all of these spans without having to manually define this on each of these. You could set this for like your entire project, or you could just set it for one component, whatever you want, but very, very convenient. This way you don't have to remember what your transitions are, like what your base transitions are. You can overwrite these if you want them changed just for one of them. You could totally overwrite them for that. That's totally fine, but I find this to be very, very convenient. So now let's actually think about a little bit more of our animation. Again, I want to buy myself a little more screen real estate, so we'll kind of collapse these, and then I'll open up our variants right here. The interesting thing about this animation, at least the way that I've set it up, is it's kind of a two-stage animation. So if you can kind of imagine that, let me kind of zoom in over here. So first we want to take everything and we want to collapse it towards the middle, right? So first we want to center everything. And only after everything is centered do we then want to rotate it by 45 degrees. So there's two steps, right? There's the piece of centering everything in the middle of the button, and then there's the step of rotating. You don't really want to do them both at the same time. It'll look a little bit jank. Maybe you'll think it'll look cool. I have no idea. Try it out if you want, but I think it looks better if we do it as two steps. In order to do it in two steps, we don't want to immediately rotate by 45 degrees, right? We actually want to kind of wait a beat. We want to wait for half of the animation to run, and then we want to rotate it. Because if it started rotating immediately, all of them would be rotating at different times, and it would look a little bit odd. And what all of this is getting to is this idea of keyframes. So if you've done normal kind of CSS transitions before, I'm sure you've used keyframes where you have like kind of different stops for animations. And we can do a very similar idea in framer motion. All that you have to do to define multiple stops is just add an array like this, and then you can add multiple parts to your animation. So I could say 0 degrees to 45 degrees, something like this. Now what we're actually going to see is this looks exactly the same. That's because we're just saying, hey, go from a starting point of 0 degrees to 45 degrees. What we actually want is we want this to wait half the time. So we want to say, hey, I want to go from 0 degrees to 0 degrees for kind of like the first half of the animation, and then from 0 degrees to 45 degrees after it's kind of waited half of the animation. And what we should see now is once I click on this, it waits half of the kind of time. It goes from 0 degrees to 0 degrees, which obviously doesn't look any different. And then it only rotates 45 degrees after it's done that. Let's do this in both directions actually, so that you can kind of see it both ways. I copy this down to my rotate down here, but instead our kind of end state is 0 degrees. And our beginning state is 45 degrees. And the first thing that we want to do is go from 45 degrees back to 0 degrees. So we'll go 45, 0, 0, something like that. Now I'll click it, waits a tick, and then it rotates. Click it again, waits a second, and then it rotates. Or actually, it rotates immediately, and then it waits. But you can't really see that last pause. In order to actually be able to see that, though, let's work on the other part of this animation, which is not the rotation, it's the centering. So we want to take this top bar and move it down to the center. Now, for this top one, all that we really need to do is animate our top value right here. That's this 35%. So we want to animate it from 35% to 50%. So I'm going to go ahead under my open, and I'm going to say I want to animate top. And it's going to start at whatever that starting value is, right? 35%. And I want to animate that to 50%. And I want it to stay at 50% for the last chunk of my animation. So if you think this through, we're going to start with a 0 degree transform and a 35%, or a 0 degree rotation rather, a 35% top value. And the first thing that's going to change is we're going to go from 35% to 50%. Our rotate hasn't actually changed yet. And then we're going to do our rotation without our top changing at all, if that makes sense. If we actually look at this in practice, I'll click save on that. We should see that it kind of transforms down and then it rotates. So I can keep on clicking that, and we should see that this does pretty much what we're looking for. I do kind of want to do the inverse of this for my closed value as well. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my whole top chunk right here. And I'm just going to take the 35% and put it at the end. So instead of 35, 50, 50, we want to do 50, 50, 35. And there we go. So we'll click on this. It'll kind of go towards the middle, rotate, and then it'll do the exact opposite in the other direction. Sweet. The next one that we can do is just this middle one. This will actually make it look like we kind of have our little X there. So I'm just going to copy all of our variants actually, and I'm just going to drop them all down here on my middle motion span. And the cool thing about this one is we don't even have to do this top transform at all because it's already centered. We don't need to recenter it. It's already where we want it to be. The one thing that I am going to change though is I'm going to take our 45 degrees and I'm going to make these minus 45 degrees. That way this one's 45 degrees, the one above it's minus 45, and that kind of makes up our X. And if we come over now and give this a click, we should see that it looks really good. So the top one's collapsing, and now we actually have our X, and we see how this is coming together. The last one is just taking this bottom piece right here, animating it up into the middle, and then rotating it whichever way. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be layered on top of the other one, so you're not even going to be able to see it at that point. I'm going to copy our variance from this top one again, because our rotation, we'll just use that as kind of the base rotation for this bottom one. So come down to our bottom motion.span, below our class names. I'm going to remove our top right here. And I'll just at least have our little rotation to start. So 0 degrees, 0 degrees, 45 degrees. We'll give this a click and make sure that that's working. Cool. See, so it's at least doing our rotation. So everything is working as it should be. Now let's think about how we can actually center this. Well, to think that through, we're going to need to actually change two different things here, right? So we need to change both our left, because our left value is not perfectly centered, 50%, right? It's offset by 10 pixels. So the first thing that we need to do is just go from left at 50% to the middle, aka just directly to 50%. I don't even think you need to do this as a keyframe. It goes fast enough to the middle that you actually can't see any difference. So I'm just gonna go left of 50% because that's where I want this to be whenever it's open, just directly centered. But whenever it's closed, I want it to be back at that original value. So calc 50% plus 10 pixels like this. Now this is going to be a little bit stupid. Just going to shift over to the left, but at least we do see that it's kind of doing half of its positioning right. The last piece is just we need to move from the bottom up to the middle, which is going to be pretty much the same thing as we did with top in the other kind of variants. So like maybe not with this one, but with this one right here, how we're animating top from 35% to 50%. We actually want to do the exact same thing. We just want to do it from the bottom instead of the top, given that we are positioning from the bottom and not the top. So I'll just drop those values in here, and I'll change from top again to bottom. Oops, bottom like this. So it starts at 35%, again, like this. And we want to animate it to 50% before we actually rotate. And then we want to do the exact opposite whenever it's closed. So 50%, 50%, then I'll take my 35% and put that at the end. Oops, at the end. And let's see how that looks. So we're opened right now with our full hamburger menu. Click on this. Everything animates to the middle and then it rotates. Perfect. So this looks really good. There is one small issue that I still have with this though, and that we'll kind of find whenever I refresh the screen. Let's give that a shot. And we'll see that it kind of has this weird initial state. The reason for that is we're animating to our initial state, which we can fix by setting initial to false. And the way that we do that is very simple. So I'll just come up to our button right here and say for the initial animation, I just don't even want to do that. We'll say our initial state is false, our initial kind of variant. Just go with whatever the kind of output of this Boolean is, which should be closed at the beginning. Now we should see that this still works. And whenever I refresh my screen, it doesn't do anything weird. It just loads as we would expect it to, and it doesn't have any weird animations. Anyways, that is pretty much it. Congratulations. You have made an animated hamburger menu. Very fun. As always, I would massively appreciate a like and a subscribe. If you got any value out of this, the links will be in the description, all that fun stuff, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.